Hey there, welcome back to English 112. This is our class for Thursday, March 2nd. And I guess Mother Nature has had some plans for us. It seems like it's been quite a while since we've met. And luckily, I had embedded some catch up time into the syllabus, so I'm not very concerned. One of the things that I had wanted to do was to devote a class to actually working on our paper. So I'm hoping that during our course cancellation that you were able to work on your paper, much like you would have done if we were meeting in class. And what I had intended to do was to have us talk about the conventions of writing a paper. So I definitely want to discuss that. And then we can move into drama. So, as you know, our first drama is going to be Oedipus the King, and we will be watching a performance of Oedipus. It gives us more of a historical sense of the play because they try to perform it in the way that we would have experienced it in 430 BC. So it's going to be quite different than a contemporary performance. But the good news with Oedipus is that the audience during Oedipus's time would have already known the plot, which means that we ourselves also need to know the plot, and that's covered in the textbook, and I'm also going to be covering it as well. We're reading a play from 430 BC. So obviously, we are reading a translation from the Greek. And that said, every translation is tricky, especially for something that has been written this far back in the past. So it's less about understanding the play word for word because, again, we're reading a translation. As far as I'm concerned, I've never read Oedipus the King. I've read many English translations, but I don't speak Greek, so I never read it in the original. But that said, it's less about the word for word, and it's more about understanding its historical importance as well as its thematic significance. But before jumping ahead, I wanted to talk about drama. Or I'm sorry, not drama, papers. Paper number 1, which ideally would be due on the 9th, which is Thursday. That would mean that you would be handing in that paper prior to spring break, which I think is good for everyone involved. That said, if you needed an extension, you could always ask me for an extension. But just know that after the 9th, we are on spring break. So we will have a week off at that particular point in time. At this point, you should have received your journals from me. As you know, I evaluated them informally on a checkmark system, with a plus being excellent, a check plus being very good, a check being satisfactory, and there also is a less than satisfactory, non-satisfactory. And I didn't respond to grammar. It was about content, as if we were having a conversation on paper. And that might actually assist you when you are thinking about what you could write about for paper. I had suggested some paper topics. They are in the syllabus and other documents folder, but those are merely suggestions. And those are also very broad topics that can be mixed and matched with lots of other of the pieces, not necessarily just the piece that I identified. I did that purposefully because your job or part of your job is to determine a thesis, a specific viewpoint that reasonable people could disagree about, and then you are going to defend that thesis with reference from the text, with a combination of paraphrase, putting it in your own language, and also quotation, using exact language word for word. And I'm hopeful that you would have talked about the conventions of how to write a paper in previous English classes, but I also wanted to cover it as well. And if you'll remember, at the beginning of the semester, the textbook gave us some suggestions on not just how to go about reading literature, but how to go about writing literature. So that could be a useful resource as well. But if you look in the syllabus and other documents folder, you'll see that I had uploaded a handout that I would have distributed to you in person if we were meeting in person, entitled The Critical Paper. And it basically talks about the conventions of writing a paper. In fact, I can tell you this was a handout that was given to me when I was an undergraduate many years ago in college. I've saved it all of this time, and I still find it to be one of the best out there in terms of how to go about writing a paper. So this might be something that you might want to make a hard copy of, or at least reference electronically. But I wanted to talk about some of the major pieces of that. So I don't know if you've got two screens, so you could read along as I was talking about this, or if you wanted to read the handout first, stop the video here. We are at minute 5:18. And if you wanted to pick up at around 5:24, here I am back again talking about the handout that I wanted to discuss about the critical paper, not a research paper, not where you're doing outside investigation. That said, if you really have your heart set on a research paper, we can negotiate, but it's actually a more difficult exercise because not only are you incorporating the observations from other individuals, but you still have to give your original feedback as well. But you'll see that this handout on the critical paper is divided into three components: the planning phase, the writing phase, and then ultimately the presentation or the editing phase. And I can tell you that most students skip the first phase. They go straight to the second phase, which is the writing phase, and then they run out of time so that there isn't time for phase 3, which is the editing and the presentation. So I encourage you not to do that and to start earlier rather than later. And the planning stage is so essential because what most students do is they try to jump into the writing phase and write the perfect first sentence. So for instance, if you were going to write about Soldier's Home, you might begin by saying something to the effect of, in Soldier's Home by Ernest Hemingway, conflict is a major issue. And then you might decide, no, I don't care for that. So you might decide to start it another way. That Krebs is a character who is facing conflict in Hemingway's Soldier's Home. No, don't quite like that. So you might decide to start in yet another way. Conflict, as defined by Webster's Dictionary, is a, well, no, don't quite like that. By this point, you're frustrated and you've decided that you really don't want to write the paper anyway, and you set it aside. And then chances are you wait until the last minute and then you hurriedly write something. And I would suggest that instead of trying to write the perfect first sentence, start with ideas. And they don't have to make sense. They don't have to be grammatically correct. The whole point of this is just to think about what are some of the elements that I might want to talk about. And brainstorm. Conflict. Well, Krebs has conflict with his mother, and maybe I can give an example of that. Krebs has conflict with his father. In fact, they never even talk to one another, so maybe I could talk about that. Krebs has conflict with society, and I could talk a little bit about that. And Krebs even has conflict within himself. I could talk a little bit about that. I'm just generating ideas at this point, and I'm done as far as I'm concerned. And then I can go back to it tomorrow or the next day and then begin to fill in some of the specific details of how Krebs has conflict with his father and his mother and his society and himself, and continue to build on that. And then finally, what I've got is a rough draft that I can polish. Or, as I had a very wise professor in college once say, a paper's never done. You just have to hand it in at some point, which is quite true. I mean, we could spend basically an entire semester just working on this one paper, an entire year, an entire lifetime. But we don't have that kind of time. So within the confines of the time that we have, what is it that you can do? And I was estimating a 4 to 5 page paper, but it should be as long or as short as it needs to be in order for you to be able to support your thesis. You basically are much like an attorney gathering pieces of evidence to support your particular position. A good attorney can argue either side of the case, guilty or innocent. It's the same evidence, but the attorney picks and chooses the evidence that's best for their particular position. That said, the evidence might be stronger on one side rather than another, but if you've got a good attorney, they can take weak evidence and make it seem quite strong. So it's a question, again, of presentation and what are you going to include. So think of it that way. In fact, many times attorneys become English majors as undergraduates before they go to law school and then eventually become attorneys because you utilize many of the same skills about argumentation and persuasion. So your evidence, so to speak, is quotation from the text and also paraphrase. You're putting in your own language what the major elements are of the text that would support your particular position. So going back to the handout and some ideas or considerations for you in terms of planning, your job is to analyze, not to summarize. So you're not doing the junior high school book report talking about what happened to prove that you read the text. You can assume that the reader is familiar with the text and merely you are interpreting for the reader. So you have to retell those pieces of the story that are necessary for your position, but only those pieces of the story that are necessary for your position. Or, as the handout indicates, confine your comments on plot to subordinate clauses, emphasizing the main clause, the significance of that action, which is just a grammatical way of saying that the bulk of your sentences should be devoted to analysis and interpretation, not summary, not what's happening, but why those things are happening. So, as I indicated, you need to have that strong and specific thesis, that position that implies interpretive conclusions about the work, and it's put in the opening paragraph. So, that said, you may not necessarily know what your thesis is when you begin writing. That's part of the process of writing, is discovery. So, no one said that you had to write in chronological order. So, you could actually begin by writing your body paragraphs and then reread your body paragraphs and summarize all of that in 1 or 2 sentences. That's your thesis, which you can plug into the beginning or the opening paragraph. So you can work backwards. You do want to make sure that your thesis is specific and concrete. So 2 examples of a thesis that would not work. The first being, Shakespeare explores the complexities of experience. And that statement is so broad, it applies to every author and every piece of literature. So it's basically meaningless. Or saying something to the effect of, Shakespeare employs much imagery in Hamlet. My response as a reader would be, yes, so what? Most authors do. So the question is, what imagery is employed? How and why is it important? So you want to have multiple paragraphs. You definitely want an introduction. You want multiple body paragraphs. You want a concluding paragraph. And all of those paragraphs should be well developed, which means that they need to be 3 or more sentences long. You need to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. Minimum. And I understand that in different kinds of writing, journalistic writing, you might be able to write 1 or 2 sentence paragraphs, but that's not the kind of writing we do at the college level or in the workplace. And if you've got well-written paragraphs, or if you are reading well-written paragraphs, what usually happens is that the first sentence of the paragraph is called a topic sentence. And that basically summarizes, that sentence summarizes what the paragraph is about. So if you are writing well, what you should be able to do is read all of your topic sentences, your first sentences, basically get a summary of what the paper's about. You can also apply this to your reading. Now, I'm well aware that textbooks aren't particularly always well written, but in theory, if you've got a well-written textbook, you can read the first sentence of each of the paragraphs, let's say your chemistry book, and you should basically have a summary of the major points. So remember that you do need to support, because ultimately my position is to take, or my job is to take the opposite position. So you need to convince the reader. It doesn't matter whether the reader already agrees or disagrees with you. The reader's much like a judge, and it's your job to present the evidence. And then it's based on the evidence that the judge makes a decision, regardless of the judge's personal beliefs. So avoid the extremes in terms of quotation. I've seen students submit in papers with no quotes. You need to have quotes. So that's your evidence. Or with too many quotes. And I can't necessarily give you a specific number when there's too many quotes. But I can tell you that usually it's something that's obvious, that these quotes don't add any kind of value to the writing. And it sounds like you're adding quotation to give your paper length. I had indicated that your paper should be perhaps approximately 4 to 5 pages. But honestly, it should be as long as it needs to be for you to support your thesis. So the idea is not that you are hitting your 4 or 5 pages. is that you have enough ideas and enough arguments to support that thesis, which generally can be done in about 4 to 5 pages. But what students oftentimes hear is that they need to have 4 or 5 pages of writing, not necessarily 4 to 5 pages of arguments. So they end up using a lot of unnecessary language and unnecessary quotation to give their paper length. So you don't want to do that. The conclusion has to be just as developed as any other paragraph. And I know at the point of the conclusion, you're tired. I know you've said everything. You might have run out of time at this point. Save a little time and a little extra energy for the ending, the conclusion. Don't just recopy your introduction. That said, oftentimes in the introduction, you can tell the reader what it is you are going to be discussing. Your body discusses it, and then your conclusion reiterates what it was that you discussed. But you've got to do different language, and you've got to present that differently. If you are really stuck with your conclusion, one of the things that usually works is relating whatever it is you're talking about to contemporary times. 9 out of 10 times that would work. You could also relate the text you're analyzing to a related idea or a related work by the author. So, writing. The first principle, and I'm quoting here, the first principle of good writing is economy. The second is simplicity. Say as much as possible in as few words as possible. I understand this is quite challenging. It's actually challenging for me. So even English teachers have challenges. We use a lot more language than is what is usually necessary. And what you should be able to do is to finish your paper early enough so that you can set it aside and read it with a fresh eye and read each sentence independently and ask yourself at the ending of each sentence, can I restate this sentence in fewer words and still have the same meaning? And if so, 9 out of 10 times you should do it. I understand this can be painful because now you're losing length. Your 4-page paper has just become a 3-page paper. But again, better to have something that's well written and tightly written that's 3 pages than something that is 4 pages long but really should be 3 pages. The 4 pages should be from argument, not from unnecessary language. So you want to use strong verbs and nouns, adjectives and adverbs, those descriptive words. They can be fine, but you don't want to overuse them just to give your paper length. You don't want to add a whole bunch of synonyms, again, just to add length. And active to the passive voice. So you want to show in your sentences that the subject of the sentence is engaged directly in the action. Now, the subject of the sentence is who or what does the action. Now, an action is called a verb. And the subject of the sentence is a noun, a who or what, a person, a place, a thing. But that noun doesn't necessarily have to be a subject. You can have lots of nouns in a sentence. We're talking about the specific noun that is engaged in the action. So I can give you a very simple sentence, something like Lillian graded the journals, and the verb is graded. That's the action. The subject, who or what is doing the grading, is Lillian, who happens to be a person or a place or thing or idea. So that would also be a noun. Journals also are nouns. Person, place, things, or ideas. But a journal, even though it's a noun, in the sentence, it's not the subject. The subject is Lillian, who or what does the grading. This is using the active voice. Lillian graded the journals. I could use the passive voice and have the action occur to me, the subject, rather than directly engaging in the action. I could say something like, the journals were graded by Lillian. And while I'm saying the same thing, this is passive because that's as if the grading were happening rather than my engaging in doing the grading. But if this is too difficult to conceptualize, just do a simple count of words for each sentence. Lillian graded the journals, 4 words. The journals were graded by Lillian, 6 words. And the rule of conciseness, if you can say it in fewer words without sacrificing meaning, you should. So this gives you an idea of some of the things to consider. with your writing. In terms of sentences, you should vary your sentence patterns. You don't want to have too many short sentences. That'll sound very choppy. You don't want to have too many long sentences. That'll sound very dense. And you certainly don't want to have multiple sentences in a row beginning the same way. You want to vary your sentence beginnings. You want to try to avoid cliches. And of course, you need to know what a cliche is so that you can avoid using it. And overused expression. What's interesting is that when we get to our section on Shakespeare, we'll talk about that many cliches were actually originally created by Shakespeare, and they were original at the time, but they no longer are. They've become so quoted in everyday language. So people quoting Shakespeare all the time, and they don't even realize it. That said, better to put it in your own words. This is a way for you to have a certain level of originality. And the reason why we say this is because there's just a greater chance of misunderstanding where you're using a cliche or a tried expression, or if you are also using slang, which is informal language usually created by one group to exclude other groups. Think about what adolescents do. They create their slang every generation to exclude the adults. So they have their own language. That said, sometimes slang goes mainstream and everybody uses it, and then it seemingly is commonplace. So if I were to say, let's say a slang term like cool, he's a cool person. I'm not talking about his temperature, I'm talking about his temperament. And I think that most people would understand that, but imagine if English were not your first language. If it were your second or your third or your fourth language, you probably are struggling enough to understand that cool is related to a lower temperature, let alone that cool, in some contexts, could also be related to an engaging personality. So I always give a real-life story to try to indicate how there is a greater possibility for misunderstanding when you are using slang or when you are using cliches. Things like it's raining cats and dogs. What do cats and dogs have to do with rain? And if you were to say it's raining dogs and cats, one of the first things you'll probably hear in response is, oh, you've said it wrong. Why it is cats go before dogs, there really is no rhyme or reason, which actually rhyme or reason is a cliche from Shakespeare. But that said, I once had a student who argued that it's alphabetical. Cats C goes before dogs D. It's hard to argue with that. But that probably is not necessarily the reason why we state the expression the way we do. It's just something that we've learned and we've become accustomed to. So, this said, the real life story, which unfortunately is true, it happened a couple of decades ago, and perhaps you heard of it or read of it. It was a second language student who was going to a party. He ended up going to the wrong home, a home that had been burglarized previously. So shall we say that the owner was anxious? And the owner opened the door, the student knocked on the door. The owner opened the door. The student asked, is this where the party is? And the owner responded with a piece of slang that I suspect most, if not all of you know. The owner said freeze, which would mean to stop, halt. The student either misheard or misunderstood. No one's quite sure what happened, but he took a step forward, which is the exact opposite of freezing. And the owner of the home responded by taking out his gun, which he always carried with him, and shooting it off and killing that student on his doorstep, all because of a misunderstanding. So it really changed how English was taught in classrooms across America, that yes, you need to know the formal academic conventions. We need to have some area of agreement so there's less possibility of misunderstanding. But in the real world, you also need to know the language of the streets, so to speak, the slang, the way that we communicate with one another. But I always use this example as to why it is when we're writing, we try to avoid possibilities for miscommunication. So better to be more conservative than less conservative. In fact, I was taught in such a conservative way that we were encouraged to avoid contractions. When you use two words, like do and not, and then you contract them or make them into one word, don't, to try to avoid the use of contractions. Again, there's some dispute about this, but you can never go wrong by erring on the side of being conservative. Just like avoiding the use of I in your writing. If for no other reason, it can be quite wordy. I think that young Goodman Brown is full of sin. You don't have to say, I think. The entire paper is what you think. You can just say Goodman Brown is full of sin, or whatever the statement is that you wanted to make. So you could delete the I's. And something that seems quite counterintuitive in terms of writing is tense. That I'm very well aware that you probably are going to be tempted to write about these pieces of literature in the past tense. After all, they were written in the past. And you read them in the past. Even if you read them just 5 minutes ago, it was the past. But you should maintain the present tense. This is the convention for literature. You're talking about something as if it is happening in the now. That's what makes literature timeless and universal. So when we are talking about a text like a sorrowful woman, it's not that the sorrowful woman said, it's that the sorrowful woman says, as if it's happening now. If you find this difficult to do, well then in the proofreading stage, you can go back and change all of the past tense to the present tense. So now we've got the last piece of this handout here, which talks about proofreading to avoid mistakes in previous papers. Keep in mind that you all have the option of revising the first paper once I've returned it to you, which I will evaluate for grammar and mechanics, as well as content, with the letter grade. And if you're content with your letter grade, you're done. But if you would like to earn a higher grade, you can take my comments into account. And if you still need further direction, you can always make an appointment with me and we could discuss it further. And after you've revised, I ask that you submit in that revision along with the original with my comments on it so I can compare and contrast. And then you get the higher of the two grades. And I don't feel like I'm giving you any kind of unfair advantage. Honestly, this is the way professional authors write, with a lot of editorial feedback. That said, your second paper will be due at the ending of the semester, so there probably wouldn't be time for revision. But the hope is that the first paper is the learning experience, so that when we get to the second paper, which will be on drama, that ultimately you could just incorporate everything that you've learned about writing a paper, so you wouldn't need to revise. But that said, I have had students in the past who've negotiated with me if you could get in the paper early enough, and there might be the possibility of a revision, but we need to negotiate that. It's not guaranteed the way it is with the first paper. And your revision is due by the ending of the semester, but that means you've got time to work on that revision. But the earlier the better, obviously, for everyone involved. So, certainly hand in your paper on time. If you can't hand in your paper on time, do ask for an extension. Proofreading your paper. Ideally, you should put your paper away for a period of time so that you can see it with a fresh eye. If you have trouble concentrating when you proofread, you might want to work backwards. In other words, read from the ending, page 4, to the front, page 1. And obviously, it won't make a whole lot of sense. That's the whole point, so that you can focus on the sentences themselves. Each sentence should basically express a complete idea. So, you need to have a title. The title needs to be original and should reflect your thesis. So you don't want to call your paper the name of the work. So you don't want to call your paper Girl, for instance, if you're writing about girl. Now, that said, you can incorporate the title into your own writing. So you could say something like Gender Issues Examined in Girl. So you're still contributing your own language as well as adding the title. Now, there are some conventions with titles in that we usually put, or at least titles to published works. We usually put the titles of short stories that have been published in quotation marks. And we put the titles of dramas or also novels, anything that can stand on its own. We either underline that or we italicize. So this lets the reader know if we're working with a drama or a novel as opposed to a short story. That said, you don't have to do anything with your personal title. You don't have to put in quotation marks. You don't need to underline it. You don't need to italicize it. You don't need to bold it. You don't need to put it in a different font. None of those things. So that said, if you do, though, incorporate the title of a published work within your own title, then yes, the title of the published work should either be in quotation marks, if it's a short story, or it should be underlined or italicized if it happens to be a novel or it happens to be a drama. You should identify the work and the author in the first paragraph along with your thesis. So it's very clear to the reader what your thesis is and which author you're discussing and which work you're discussing right before they begin reading your paper. And to give you an idea of how old this handout is, it says instructors prefer typewritten papers. The paper must be typed, double-spaced, 1-inch margins. The syllabus talks a little bit about this, about the formatting of a paper. It should also have a title page, which is also a separate sheet of paper that lists your title, your name, my name, the due date, the class. And again, not necessarily always required, but if the instructor requests it, according to the MLA, the Modern Language Association, which is the association that comes up with the conventions or rules of writing, then you should follow that instructor's desires. So that said, I am asking for a cover page. And in terms of thinking about quotation, if you can look in the notes below, I've given you some examples of how you could go about quoting. We are using the MLA system, Modern Language Association system of parenthetical documentation. In other words, what that means is that at the ending of the quote, regardless of whether or not the sentence is completed, it doesn't matter. At the ending of the quote, we use parentheses, and within those parentheses, we indicate the location of that quote. We put the least amount of information necessary in order to identify that quote. That's usually page number. If you're working with multiple sources, you might need to do more than just page number. In order to clarify for the reader, you might need to put the author's last name. If you've got multiple sources by the same author, the author's surname may not be enough, then you may need to put part of the title. So it basically builds upon itself. Since you aren't doing a research paper, you're doing a critical paper, you basically are quoting just from the text itself, so page number should suffice in this instance. And you can see that the examples below will give you some ideas. This is under documentation for MLA. The examples below will give you an idea of what it looks like. So our textbook also talks about this as well. So punctuation goes after the parenthetical documentation. So for instance, quote, Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote. And then we open our parentheses. 162 is the page number, close our parentheses, and then our closing punctuation, which happens to be a period. Or if you're not done with your sentence, you can continue on with your sentence. Sentence continuation after documentation. So here's the example. Quote, although Krebs went to the war from a Methodist college, unquote, open parentheses, 162, close parentheses, he cannot pray with his mother. So the sentence continued, but again, we put the documentation immediately after the quote. Now, you can insert your own language into a quote, not to comment on the quote, but to clarify something. And that said, it often is about pronouns, where the pronoun might make sense based in the context of the story as a whole, but it may not make sense based on the quotation that you've selected. So you might want to be more specific. So the example I gave you, again, from Soldier's Home, quote, even his, and then in square brackets, I have the name Krebs, close square brackets, lies were not sensational, unquote. And then in documentation 162. Basically, the quote reads, even his lies were not sensational, but the his could have referred to any of a number of characters, perhaps, if I'm just using this one sentence. And if it's not clear based on the way that I've introduced this quotation in my paper, then I might want to clarify after the pronoun his, the name Krebs, that the his is in reference specifically to that character. Again, not to comment on the relevance of a quote. You can do that after the quote, which is why we usually say it's a bad idea to end a paragraph with a quote, generally speaking, because you want to comment on the relevance. I'm not saying that you can't do it. I'm just saying that you should be cautious about it. And omissions, if you wanted to omit part of a quote, not because you want to change the meaning of the quote, but something that just doesn't, it isn't necessary. Then what you could use is an ellipsis. Those are 3 periods. You've probably seen them before, but there's an example in our notes below. And what that means is that a word or several words were omitted. So the example I've given you is Krebs, comma, quote, during his time, period, was asleep late in bed, unquote, and then the parentheses with the documentation. So during this time, there were words after that I didn't feel were necessary, that didn't sacrifice the meaning. So I used an ellipsis, period, to indicate that there was a word or words that followed after that I did not include in the specific quote. Purdue Owl. You might be familiar with Purdue Owl. They are a website that talks about the conventions of writing from Purdue University, but they've made it accessible to the public. I highly recommend it. So does the GCC library, because it's included on their list of sites and resources. In the notes below, you can see that I've included the link to that, where it talks about some of what I've talked about and the entire process of writing, actually, as well as documentation. The GCC library site, you can see that I've given you a link for that as well, specifically for their writing and citation guides, because they're well aware that you will be writing papers in college. That said, ultimately, there are lots of different writing and citation guides, and you might have something from a previous class. Again, our college textbook in our class talks a bit about it as well as talking about documentation. So there's lots of different places that you can find that. The last thing really that I can think about saying is if you've got a long quote, the convention is if the quote is over 3 lines long or so, that you can block it off. In other words, that what you're going to do is to indent that quote so that it is blocked off from the main text, so that it's very clear that basically you are quoting by blocking it off. Usually an opening quote mark is your cue that a closing quote mark is coming soon. But if you've got a very long quote, again over 3 lines of text, let's say, then your closing quote mark may not be coming soon. So in this instance, the convention is to block it off. I've seen it centered, or I've seen it justified to the left or the right. Personally, I like it centered. I like symmetry, but it doesn't matter. And the idea is that this piece of text will stand out so that it's clear where the quote begins, but more importantly, where the quote ends. And the convention with block quotes, by the way, is no use of quotation marks. It's considered redundant. If for no other reason, when you're blocking off a quote, you basically are telling the reader, hey, I'm quoting. And when you're using quotation marks, you're saying the same thing. So you don't need to use quotation marks. There, of course, just has to be the tiniest of little twists. And with block quotes, basically the ending punctuation comes first, then the parenthetical documentation, rather than the other way around, which is the usual convention. So that was your quickie version. I don't know how quick it might have felt to you of how to write a paper. So I realize that some of this might be new to you. So if you've got questions, certainly please ask me. I know for others of you, this is something that you've done many times previously. So I hope that this wasn't too long-winded and that it served as a solid refresher for you for when you're actually writing your paper, which would be best for you to submit before spring break, which would be on the 9th. But of course, we've got some latitude there. So what I wanted to do next class was to talk about what I would have done on Thursday the 23rd, which is discuss the elements of drama and popular forms and writing about drama. as well as talking a little bit about Sophocles and tragic character. So I should be able to combine both of those. Again, I told you my initial intention was to combine both of those and to give us a class to work on the first paper. So we'll just assume that one of those snow days was a workshop for working on the first paper. And then, if all goes well, we can move into Oedipus the King. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And for today's attendance question, because it was all about writing the paper, I just thought I'd ask, what do you think your biggest challenge is going to be writing paper number 1 and why? What do you think your biggest challenge will be and why? Take care. Talk to you next week. Bye-bye.